Slavery never ended. In 2026, on an 18,000-acre former plantation in Louisiana, Black men pick up crops by hand, under watch of armed guards on horsebacks. The plantation is called Angola, named for the country that most of the people once enslaved on its soil was stolen from. It is now the Louisiana State Penitentiary, the largest maximum security prison in the United States. The men working its fields are prisoners, the overwhelming majority of them Black. They hoe, they weed, they harvest by hand, and if they refuse, they can be sent to solitary confinement. After 3 years of this labor, they become eligible to be paid at a rate that begins at 2 cents an hour. In late May of 2026, a federal judge ruled that he could not order the changes the prisoners had asked for because a higher court had just weakened the legal standard for what counts as cruel and unusual punishment. The men are still in the fields as I record this. The legal authority for all of it is one clause in the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The amendment taught in every American school as the one that abolished slavery. Read it. It abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime. The exception is not the footnote. The exception is the subject of this chapter. I'm Chisom Udeze, and this is Overnight Wisdom. This is episode 6 of a series. This chapter, though, is a complete argument on its own, so if it's the first you're hearing, you will not be lost, and you can return to earlier chapters whenever you like. Chapter 1 made the case for calling the system white terrorism rather than white supremacy. Chapter 2 traced extractive colonialism on the African continent. Chapter 3 looked at settler colonialism in 2026. Chapter 4 set out the operating system, essentially racism that runs through all of them. And chapter 5 examined the compound, what that system does when it concentrates on a single body. So this episode and this chapter turns to the place where the whole series has been circling around, which is essentially the 400-year case of the Black American experience, and argues that it is in and of itself white terrorism. I am Nigerian. I am not Black American. And for most of this series, I have articulated about the American experience only at its edges. And I believe in a second episode, I said very plainly that I was not certain it was my story to tell. I have decided, though, that it is mine to engage, not because I claim it, but because this series cannot complete its arguments without it. And because the most uncomfortable part of this story, the part about what people like me have done to Black Americans, is also precisely the part of the story that is mine to say. I will get to that part in a little while, but first I want to talk about the history because the history is the argument. The thesis of this chapter is simple to state and hard to absorb. Slavery in the United States did not end. It just basically changed appearance. Every time one form of control became politically impossible and untenable to defend, the system did not necessarily loosen its grip. It just renamed itself. And the new name was always respectable enough to let the country believe the old thing was finally over. It began as chattel slavery, the system that treated human beings as property to be bought, sold, worked, and inherited, with the condition passed from mother to child into perpetuity. When the Civil War ended, the southern states wrote the Black Codes, basically laws that turned ordinary Black people and life itself into a crime so that a freed person could be arrested for being unemployed, for being out after dark, for gathering in a group. These arrests fed convict leasing, which is basically the practice of renting Black prisoners to plantations, to mines, to railroads, to labor for no pay under conditions that frequently killed them, which is why the historian who documented it titled his book Slavery by Another Name. Running alongside it was sharecropping and debt peonage, an arrangement that bound Black families to white-owned land through debts engineered to never be cleared. All of it was held in place by lynching and massacres, public killings designed to keep an entire people afraid. The whole apparatus was eventually formalized into Jim Crow, the regime of legal segregation that stripped Black Americans of the vote and walled them out of every shared institution for the better part of a century. When millions fled it, they made redlining in the North. The government-drawn maps that marked Black neighborhoods as unfit for lending and starved them of the wealth that was building the white middle class. And when the civil rights movement finally dismantled the legal scaffolding of Jim Crow, the system answered with mass incarceration, which returned through a single clause in the 13th Amendment to the original practice itself, where Black people were forced into labor without freedom on plantations under guard. The line from the first slave ship to the Angola farm line in 2026 has never really been cut. It has only been renamed in every generation by people who needed to believe the previous chapter was closed. This episode argues that the Black American experience is itself white terrorism by the definition this series has used from the beginning, which basically is the systematic use of violence to control a population through fear, not a historical episode of it. This is the longest running case of it on Earth, 400 years unbroken. So let's talk about your unbroken line. The slavery that built America was not the slavery the ancient world knew, and it was not the slavery that existed in pre-colonial Africa, a point I made in one of the chapters. I believe it was in episode 2. And I also want to return to here because it is the first thing often thrown at this argument. American chattel slavery was racialized, hereditary, and perpetual. It made Blackness itself the legal mark of enslavability. A child born to an enslaved woman inherited her condition at birth by statute for life, and so did the child's child, a rule that the Virginia colony fixed into law in 1662, and the other colonies followed. This fusion of slavery with race, passed down through the mother and made to last forever, was not unique to the territory that became the United States. It was the innovation of the whole Atlantic slave system worked out across plantations, Americas from Brazil to the Caribbean, and the English mainland colonies codified it in some of the most absolute form. What the American case did distinctively was bind that system to an industrializing capitalism on a continental scale, which is why the wealth it produced compounded into a racial caste that outlived the institution by more than a century, and it is measurable in dollars today. And the wealth was the point. By 1860, the 4 million enslaved people in the United States were worth more as property than all of the country's banks, railroads, and factories combined. Enslaved people were not brought to the United States to build the economy or to America to build the economy. They were the economy. The cotton they grew under the whip was the nation's largest export and the raw material of the global industrial revolution. Black Americans did not arrive into American wealth. American wealth was extracted from their bodies. For a brief moment, the country gestured at repair. After the Civil War, during the 12 years of Reconstruction, Black Americans did what the system never expected. They built, they voted, they held office. More than 1,500 Black men held public office across the South. They founded schools and churches and newspapers and businesses. They began to gather the first sliver of land and wealth. The promise of 40 acres was made, and for a moment, the country looked like it might honor what it owed. But that moment was destroyed by terror, and not metaphorical terror. Organized paramilitary violence by former Confederates, the Ku Klux Klan, and its many successors, aimed at making Black political participation impossible. On Easter Sunday of 1873 in Colfax, Louisiana, a white mob murdered between 62 and 153 Black men, most of them after they had already surrendered. The historian Eric Foner called it the bloodiest single instance of racial carnage in the Reconstruction era. 3 white men were convicted in 1876 in United States versus Cruikshank. The Supreme Court overturned even those convictions ruling that the federal government had no power to prosecute the attackers and gutting the enforcement of the very constitutional amendments meant to protect Black citizens. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented at least 2,000 racial terror lynchings in the Reconstruction years alone. In 1877, in a backroom bargain to settle a disputed presidential election, the federal government withdrew the last troops from the South and left Black Americans to the people who had just spent 12 years killing them. Reconstruction did not just fade, it was essentially overthrown. Here was where the system changed clothes for the first time. The southern states read the 13th Amendment exception as an instruction. Then they wrote the black codes to fill their jails and lease the prisoners back to the same planters and the new industrialists. The conditions were frequently deadlier than slavery had been because the man who had owned a slave for life had a reason to keep him alive, and the man who rented a convict for a season did not. The journalist Douglas Blackmon gave it the very accurate name in the title of his history of it, basically slavery by another name. It was the second slavery. It was legal and it lasted into the 20th century. For those not swept up in the convict system, there was sharecropping and debt peonage, the rigged accounts at the landowner's stores, and left families deparing debt each year by design, tied to the land of the people who had recently enslaved and owned them. All of it was enforced by terror, and terror was public design between the end of Reconstruction and 1950. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented more than 4,000 racial terror lynches across the South, and nearly 6,500 in total once the Reconstruction years are counted. These were not killings carried out in secret. They were public spectacles, advertised in advance, attended by crowds in the thousands, with photographs sold afterwards as postcards and body parts taken as souvenirs. The purpose was not to punish an individual, it was to terrorize an entire population into submission. The textbook definition of terrorism. And when the Black community grew prosperous enough to threaten the racial order, the terror escalated to massacre. In Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, a white mob overthrew a legitimately elected biracial city government by force. Basically, to the best of my knowledge, it was the only successful coup against a sitting American government in the country's history. In Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, when Black sharecroppers organized to demand fair pay, a white mob killed as many as several hundreds of them. In Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, a white mob burned Greenwood, the most prosperous Black district in the country, known as Black Wall Street, to the ground, murdering as many as 300 people and destroying more than 1,000 homes and businesses in less than 2 days. In Rosewood, Florida in 1923, a white mob destroyed an entire Black town. The pattern was consistent. Black Americans would build against every obstacle, against every odd, and when what they built became visible, it was burned to the ground. The whole arrangement was formalized into Jim Crow, which the Supreme Court essentially blessed in 1896 as separate but equal, and it became the American apartheid that held for the better part of a century through poll taxes, literacy tests, and also terror. It was not the absence of law, it was the full weight of the law turned against the people. And so Black Americans fled. Between 1910 and 1970, 6 million Black Americans left the South, basically the largest internal migration in American history, escaping a domestic reign of terror in the only direction open to them, north or west. I think outside of the US, this is rarely taught as what it was, a refugee movement, millions of people fleeing violence inside their own country. What they found was the system in its northern form, not the whip and not the lynch mob, but the red line drawn by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s, the federal maps that turned whole Black neighborhoods into no-lending zones. For decades, the home loans that built the white middle class were denied to Black families. Their neighborhoods then were starved of investment. They were cut through with highways and policed as containment. The ghetto was not an accident of Black poverty. It was an instrument of policy. The wealth gap that resulted is a direct and measurable residue. In 2026, the median Black household holds roughly 15 cents of wealth for every dollar held by the median white household. About $44,000 against 284,000. Further back, the economists Elora Derenoncourt, Chi Hyun Kim, Moritz Kuhn, and Moritz Schularik built the first continuous record of Black and white wealth from 1860 to the present, and they put the per-person ratio at roughly 2 cents on the dollar in the year just after emancipation. It rose for a few decades, and then around the 1950s, the convergence stalled, and since the 1980s, the gap has widened again, so that by their measure, it is nearly as large now as it was in the 1950s. Whether you count by head or by household, the verdict is essentially the same. A century and a half of nominal freedom moved the gap from near nothing to somewhere around a sixth, and then it stopped. And the thing we must understand is at that rate, the gap does not close, it just calcifies. And then Black Americans did the thing I also want to talk about. They forced the country to honor its own constitution. The civil rights movement was not a request. It was a campaign sustained over decades and paid for in lives that compelled the United States to extend to Black Americans the rights its founding documents had promised everyone and delivered to almost no one who was not white. And the rights they won did not stay with them. The legal architecture Black Americans built, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the 14 Rights Act of 1965, the principle that discrimination is unlawful, became the foundation that women and other racialized groups or religious minorities, disabled Americans, and immigrants, including African immigrants, would all later stand on. Black Americans wrote the template for freedom that the rest of the country and much of the world now uses. And the system then changed clothes again. Within a generation of the civil rights victories, a new architecture of control emerged, what the legal scholar Michelle Alexander named the new Jim Crow. The war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, and the largest prison expansion in human history produced a country that holds about 5% of the planet's population and roughly a quarter of its prisoners. Black Americans, who make up about 13% of the population, are roughly 37% of the people in prisons and jails. And once incarcerated, by the express text of the 13th Amendment, they can be compelled to work without pay, which returns us to the men in the fields at Angola, on the former plantation under the guards on horsebacks, picking crops by hand in 2026. In 2024, voters of California, one of the most liberal states in the country, were given the chance to strike down the slavery exception from their state constitution. They declined. So the measure failed. Lawmakers have moved to put a revised version back before voters in 2026. As I record this, in most of America, it remains legal to enslave a person convicted of a crime because the Constitution still says so, and the country has not yet chosen to change it. The line has never been cut. That is my argument. I also want to name what we have just walked through against the definition this series has been building since the very first episode. Terrorism is a systematic use of violence to control a population through fear, not random violence. Systematic violence, not violence for its own sake, violence in the service of control, not control of an individual, control of a population. If we hold the Black American experience against that definition, 400 years of violence, organized and sustained, slavery was enforced by the whip and the auction block, which broke families on purpose as policy to prevent solidarity. Reconstruction overthrown by paramilitary massacre. The convict leasing as second slavery. The public spectacle of lynching designed in its own participants' word to keep the entire people afraid. The burning of whole towns when they prospered. A migration of 6 million refugees fleeing domestic terror. A carceral system that returned forced on free labor to the literal soil of the plantation. This is not a series of regrettable episodes in an otherwise decent national story. It is a single continuous campaign, and it meets the definition of terrorism more completely and for longer than any other case this series has examined. The longest war America has ever fought is the one it waged without interruption against the people who built it. And yet, here is the thing the system could not do. It could not erase Black Americans. Black Americans are not transplanted Africans. They are people who came into being in America, forged in the specific fire of American slavery and the 4 centuries of terror that followed. A distinct people with a distinct culture, and that culture is now the closest thing the world has to a shared culture. I want to say this precisely because it is the counterweight to everything that I have previously said, and it is simply true. The people the system spent 400 years trying to reduce to property and then to dust, produce the music the entire planet listens to. Out of the plantations came the spirituals. Out of the spirituals and the blues came jazz and gospel and rhythm and blues. And out of those came rock and roll, soul, funk, and hip hop, now the dominant popular music on earth. In Lagos, and in Seoul, and in London, and in Sao Paulo. The vernacular of Black America, the cadence, and the grammar that linguists have recognized as a rule-governed language in its own right is borrowed and imitated worldwide, very often by the same people who hold its originators in contempt. The freedom vocabulary of the civil rights movement, the marches, the language of rights and dignity became the template every liberation movement on earth has reached for since, from South Africa to Northern Ireland to Hong Kong. Black American writers, athletes, scientists, soldiers, and preachers shape the country and the century. This is not a consolation prize appended to a record of suffering. It is evidence. A people who could actually be reduced to what the system tried to reduce them to could not have built what Black Americans built. The culture is the proof that the terror failed at its deepest purpose. It set out to produce property, but it couldn't take over a people, and the people built the country, and then they built the thing that the whole world loves about the country, and yet they are locked out of the house they built this entire time. As usual, I'm going to talk about the predictable critiques. This episode draws fire from 2 main directions, so I will handle the predictable attacks directly. The first is that slavery existed everywhere and Africans sold slaves too, so American slavery was nothing special. I also touched on this in, I believe, the second episode, and I want to make it here again. Slavery had existed in many human societies. The racialized, the hereditary, and the perpetual chattel slavery of the plantation Americas was already a departure from almost all of them. What sets the American case apart is what it did with that system. It bound the system to an industrializing economy on a continental scale, and it left behind a racial caste that has outlived the institution by more than a century and a half and remains measurable in dollars today. This is what makes it the subject of this chapter. That Africans participated in the trade, which they did, and which I also named in the second series, does not touch the specific character of what America built. Both facts are true, but only one is the subject here. The second is the counterfactual that Black Americans are better off than they would have been in Africa. This is the enslaver's own justification still walking around in 2026 and should be named as exactly that. It was the arguments made on the floor of Congress before the Civil War that slavery was a positive good that civilized the enslaved. It is obscene on its face. It measures the worth of freedom by the comfort of the cage. And the only reason it still gets spoken is that the people who say it have never once had to apply it to themselves. A third criticism that I want to address, because this chapter's spine depends on it, is that comparing prison to slavery is hyperbole. It is not hyperbole. It is a text of the Constitution. The 13th Amendment permits involuntary servitude as punishment for crime. In those words, the men at Angola are working a former plantation without pay under armed guards by law right this moment. Convict leasing was adjudicated at the time as legal. The claim is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a description of a legal mechanism that has operated continuously in changing forms since 1865, and the majority of California voters chose to keep in 2024. The burden is not on me to prove the continuity. The continuity is written down. The fourth that I want to address is the black on black crime deflection. So basically it's the move that says that the real threat to black Americans is each other. So why discuss police or history at all? So let's begin with the phrase, which is a manufactured category. There is no parallel discourse of white on white crime. Although white Americans, like all people everywhere, are overwhelmingly harmed by members of their own group because violent crime is overwhelmingly intra-racial for everyone, since people tend to harm those they live near. And the United States keeps its people racially separated by the very design this chapter has traced. The concentrated violence the phrase points to is real, and it is also the direct product of the continuity, the wealth that was stripped away, the neighborhoods deliberately starved and contained, the generation of men removed into carceral systems, guns and drugs routed into sealed communities. To name that violence as evidence of Black deficiency rather than the design consequence of everything that I have previously named is to blame a people for the conditions built around them. It takes the harm the system produced and reattributes it to the people the system harmed. The wound presented essentially as the flaw. And this is basically an example of reversing deliberately cause and effect. The fifth that I want to address is the model minority comparison, basically the claim that other groups arrived with nothing and rose, so the failure must be cultural. And now it is often made with a sharper edge that uses the success of African and Caribbean immigrants as the wedge. So look, essentially it says, Black immigrants thrive, so the problem cannot be race. I'm going to talk about this soon because it is also the bias I most need to confront in my own community. Right now, I will only name the shape of the answer. African immigrants to the United States are among the most educated arrivals in the country, but that is the selection effect. They are a self-select group who came through narrow educational and professional visa channels, carrying the human capital that generations of schooling in their home countries gave them. Black Americans are the descendants of people forbidden by law to read, then denied schooling, then denied the votes, then denied home loans, and denied the accumulation of wealth across every generation that this episode has named. To compare the two and conclude that culture is the variable is not analysis. It is the deliberate erasure of 400 years of difference in starting conditions. The sixth and potentially the most generic claim is the pseudoscience that resurfaces in every generation to recast Black American outcomes as innate rather than structural. Listen, in episode 4, I took this apart already because race is a political category, not a biological one. The genetic variation within any so-called race exceeds the variation between them. There is no gene for the wealth gap. There is a 400-year policy record. It is sufficient. It is documented. And the reach for biology is what people do when they have decided in advance not to look at the evidence. And the seventh is addressed to me. What gives me, a Nigerian, the standing to tell this story? I'm going to talk about that next. But I also just want to name upfront that I do not have the standing of someone who lived it. I have a different standing, the standing of someone whose own community is implicated and who can therefore say the uncomfortable thing from the inside. That is the only standing I'm claiming, and it is the one that I'm going to dive into next. So I want to talk to Africans now. Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. I want to do it with grace because what I am about to describe was taught to us. And I also want to do it with compassion because the same machine that worked on Black Americans worked on us too, but in a different room. But I'm going to say it plainly because grace without honesty is just another form of flattery, and I'm not about that. Many Africans hold bias against Black Americans, and most of us will not admit it. When we arrive in the US or we watch the US from Lagos and Accra and Nairobi, and we observe the idea that Black Americans are lazy, that they are criminal, that they complain too much, that they were handed opportunities we would have seized, that their condition is their own fault, we say often quietly and sometimes honestly aloud that we are not like them. We teach our children sometimes without a single word to keep their distance. I want us to see three things clearly. The first is who Black Americans actually are and who we are in relation to them. The line we draw between ourselves and Black Americans is a line white terrorism drew first. The same ships came to the coast. The difference between the Africans whose ancestors stayed and the Black Americans whose ancestors were taken is not a difference of character or a difference of words. It was a difference of which side of a transaction our ancestors were on. A transaction neither of them chose. When we hold ourselves above Black Americans, we are not expressing African pride. We are maintaining a hierarchy the enslavers built, and we are doing their maintenance for free. The second thing I want to name is where the bias actually comes from. We did not invent our contempt for Black Americans. We imported it. We learned it from the same American films and television and news that taught the entire world to fear Black Americans. The same images, the same stereotypes, manufactured by the same system this episode has spent its length describing. When an African says Black Americans are criminal, that African is not reporting an observation. They are repeating an advertisement. The bias was placed in us deliberately by the people it serves, and we have been carrying their cargo and calling it our own opinion. The third is what we owe and what we have refused to see that we owe. Many Africans are in the U.S. at all because Black Americans made it possible. The immigration law that opened the United States to large-scale African arrival, the Act of 1965 that abolished the racist national origin quotas, was passed in the same movement under the same pressure in the same years as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. African immigrants walked through a door that Black Americans broke open with their bodies. The anti-discrimination protections that has the potential to shield people in the workplaces, the seats our children fill, the very possibility of a Black person being treated as a full citizen in the United States, although that is also debatable, all of it was won by Black Americans at a cost they are still paying. And too many of us have accepted the inheritance while withholding the acknowledgement. We consume their music, we wear their culture, we borrow their slang and their style and their freedom vocabulary, and then we hold the people who made it all in contempt. This is not merely ingratitude, it is the exact pattern the whole chapter has described, the consumption of what Black Americans made alongside the refusal to respect or protect them. And when we do it, we are not the victim of the pattern. We are running the pattern. So I'm asking us to do better. And I'm asking it with love because I am one of us and this is my correction too. We have to stop drawing the line the enslavers drew. We have to stop repeating the advertisements. We have to recognize the depths and build solidarity with Black Americans instead of distance from them. Because the distance was always a trick and the people who taught it to us were never our friends. And now I want to speak to Black Americans. And I really want to be careful because I know there's a version of this story that is not mine to tell. I am not American. I have not lived this. The last thing this episode should become, especially as it's close, is a Nigerian standing over Black Americans to explain it to itself. So I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. I'm going to do the one honest thing I can do from where I stand, which is to say it plainly from outside the house, because sometimes I think it matters that someone outside says whose house it is. This series on calling it white terrorism has run on three clarities: identity, context, and power. I will name them here, not to hand you a framework, you have never needed mine, but because when I turn them towards Black America, what they show me is not work left undone. It is work already done against everything for 4 centuries. Identity clarity is knowing who you are underneath who the system says you are. And it is the one thing this architecture spent 400 years trying to take away from you, and it never could. You were written into law as a problem. First as a problem of property, then of freedom, then of crime. And none of it took because you never believed it. You were not the problem in the American story. You are its foundation. You were in the U.S. in 1619 before the Mayflower, before nearly every white family that now calls itself native. You grew the cotton that built the banks and the mills. You laid the rails and raised the houses. And when the country needed a conscience, you supplied that too. There is no American country. There is no American music, no American English, no American idea of freedom that means anything without Black Americans. You were never a guest who overstayed. You are the host. The house is yours, and you have always known it. I'm only saying it from my position where it can be heard. Context clarity is seeing the terrain as it actually is and refusing the story it tells about itself. And you have read this terrain more clearly than the people who built the terrain because you had no choice. You were told generation after generation that the door would be opened if you worked harder, if you complied more, if you waited longer, and you learned at a price no one should ever have to pay, that the door was built shut. That was never despair, it was sight. And the energy your country spends trying to talk you out of what you plainly see is the surest proof that what you see is true. Power clarity is knowing what is actually yours, and you have used it on a scale almost nothing in history matches. With less than nothing, hunted, kept poor by design, and told you were no one, you have changed the world. The template every people on earth now reaches for when it wants to be free. You wrote it. The culture the planet loves most. You made it. You have never once stopped building, so I'm not going to tell you to build. I'm going to say that none of what you made was ever evidence that you needed saving. You have been the ones doing the saving of a country that did not deserve you for 400 years. No one outside your experience has the standing to ask you to forgive, and no one has the right to charge you for the culture you have already given the world for nothing. The freedom you're still owed, and you are owed it, has never once been handed over. It has only ever been taken by you. The way you have taken every other thing, your country was finally forced to concede. The work was always yours, and the work was always magnificent, and it was never, for a single day, evidence that the terror succeeded. So in closing, the U.S. variation of slavery set out to make property, and yet the people survived it. That is the whole of it in the end. 400 years of the most sustained terror a country has ever turned on its own people. Slavery and the overthrow of Reconstruction and the convict camps and the lynching trees and the burned towns and the red lines and the prison farms. The machines running without a break from 1619 to the men in the fields at Angola this year. And under all its changing clothes, the machine had one fundamental purpose: to raise a people into a function. It failed. The people are still here. They are still building. They made America. They made the thing the world loves most about America. Black Americans are the people the terror could not erase. That is not hope. It is record. This was episode 6. If this episode resonated with you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Overnight Wisdom wherever you get your podcasts, and join my newsletter, The Weekly Clarity, at chisomudeze.com, where I bring the same structural analysis to leadership, power, systems every week. I'm Chisom Udeze, and this is Overnight Wisdom. Thank you so much for being here.